For weeks, something about the housemaid had been bothering him. Every Tuesday and Wednesday evening, she quietly slipped out of the house earlier than usual. She always returned late at night, her eyes red, her hands trembling slightly. At first, he ignored it. After all, she had worked for his family for nearly 2 decades. But then she started asking for salary advances, small ones, $100, $80, sometimes even less. That was what made him notice, because in 19 years, she had never once asked for extra money. So one evening, he decided to follow her, and what he discovered that night changed something deep inside him, something that money had never been able to touch. The billionaire who noticed everything. Adrian Whitmore was 42 years old and one of the most successful businessmen in New York. His companies owned skyscrapers, tech firms, and international supply chains. He was a man who noticed everything: numbers, contracts, financial leaks, weaknesses in competitors. But strangely, he had never really noticed the woman who had quietly held his home together for 19 years. Her name was Elena Morales. She had joined the household when Adrian's son Lucas was only 4 years old. When Adrian's wife Emily fell seriously ill years ago, Elena was the one who kept the house running. When Adrian passed away, Elena was the one who held little Lucas in her arms through the long nights while he cried for his mother. And when Adrian buried himself in work because grief was the one problem he couldn't solve, Elena made sure Lucas still had warm meals, clean clothes, and bedtime stories. She loved that family, quietly, faithfully, without ever asking for recognition, and Adrian Whitmore had never once asked about her life. The strange changes. 6 weeks ago, he began noticing the changes. Elena started leaving early twice a week, not a few minutes early, sometimes an entire hour. When she came back, she looked exhausted. Her coat was always still on, her bag looked heavy, and her eyes, they looked like she had been crying. One evening, when she placed his coffee on his desk, Adrian noticed something unusual. Her hands were shaking, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. Then came the salary advances. Elena, who had served his family for 19 years without complaint, was suddenly asking for small portions of her salary before payday. Adrian checked the household accounts. Nothing was missing, no money stolen, no suspicious transactions. Elena was not taking anything that wasn't hers, but something was wrong, and Adrian Whitmore was not the kind of man who ignored problems. The decision. One Tuesday evening, Adrian saw Elena walking toward the door at exactly 5 o'clock. Her coat was already on, her bag was over her shoulder. He watched her leave. Then he waited 30 seconds and followed her. Following the maid. Elena walked 3 blocks east and entered the subway station. Adrian followed at a distance, feeling strangely out of place in his expensive suit among the crowded commuters. Inside the train, Elena sat quietly, her hands rested in her lap, her lips moved slightly, almost like she was praying, or maybe trying not to cry. The train ride lasted 20 minutes. When she stepped off the train and climbed the subway stairs, Adrian followed again. Then he saw where she was going, and his chest tightened immediately. She was walking towards St. Matthew Medical Center, but she didn't enter through the main doors. Instead, she walked around the side of the building toward a smaller entrance. Above the door was a sign. Adrian had to read it twice: Oncology and Infusion Center. He froze. People walked past him, cars drove by, the city kept moving, but Adrian Whitmore stood completely still. Then, slowly, he walked inside. The room at the end of the hall. The hospital corridor was quiet, soft lights, muted voices, the distant sound of medical machines beeping. Elena moved through the hallway like someone who had done this many times before. She nodded at a nurse who recognized her. Then she turned into a small room near the end of the hall. The door didn't close completely. Adrian stepped closer and looked inside. There was a hospital bed, and in that bed was a boy, maybe 14 or 15 years old. He was painfully thin. An IV line ran into his arm. Dark shadows circled his tired eyes. Elena sat beside him. She took his hand gently in both of hers. Then she whispered softly, "Mi amor, Grandma is here." Adrian's breath stopped. At that moment, a nurse entered the room holding a clipboard. Her voice was gentle but serious. "Mrs. Morales, I'm sorry to bring this up tonight, but we still need to discuss the payment plan for the next round of treatment." The words hit Adrian like a punch. Payment plan? Next round of treatment? He slowly stepped away from the door and leaned against the hallway wall. Machines beeped quietly in the distance. Somewhere down the corridor, someone cried. And from inside the room, he heard the boy speak. His voice was weak, but he tried to sound cheerful. "Grandma, stop worrying. I'm okay." Adrian looked down at his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Adrian Whitmore sat on a cold metal bench outside the hospital. Cars rushed past, taxi horns echoed in the distance. Somewhere beneath the street, a subway train rumbled. But Adrian barely noticed any of it. His mind was still stuck on what he had seen. The boy in the hospital bed, the IV in his arm, the nurse talking about treatment costs, and Elena, the woman who had served his family for 19 years, sitting beside that bed like the boy was her entire world. For the first time in a very long time, Adrian Whitmore felt completely lost. 40 minutes passed. Then the hospital doors opened. Elena stepped outside. The moment she saw him sitting on the bench, she froze. Her eyes widened in shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The street noise faded into the background. Finally, Elena spoke in a quiet, careful voice. "Mr. Whitmore." She held her bag tightly in both hands. "I can explain." The conversation he never expected. Adrian slowly stood up. Normally, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who controlled everything around him. But tonight, something in his eyes had changed. They were softer, almost uncertain. "Elena," he said quietly, "you don't have to explain anything out here." She blinked in surprise. That was not the reaction she expected. "I thought," she began. "I know what you thought," Adrian said gently. "You thought I was going to fire you." Elena said nothing, but the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag told him he was right. He looked down the street for a moment before speaking again. "Can we sit somewhere and talk?" Elena nodded slowly. "There's a small cafe down the street," she said. The coffee shop. The cafe was warm and quiet. Soft yellow lights glowed above small round tables. The smell of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. It was the kind of place families came to wait when someone they loved was in the hospital. They sat near the window. A waitress came by. Adrian ordered black coffee. Elena asked for chamomile tea. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain began tapping softly against the glass window. Finally, Elena placed her hands flat on the table and took a deep breath. "His name is Matteo," she said softly. "He's my grandson." Adrian listened carefully. "He's 15 years old. His mother, my daughter Sophia, died 2 years ago in a car accident." Her voice stayed calm, but Adrian could hear the pain underneath it. "Matteo came to live with me after that." She looked down at her hands. "He's a good boy, very smart. He always talks about becoming an engineer someday." For a moment, Adrian thought about his own son, Lucas. Then Elena continued. "About 8 months ago, Matteo started getting tired all the time. He bruised easily. One day he fainted during gym class." She paused. The doctors ran tests. Adrian already knew what was coming. Her next word confirmed it. "Leukemia."
The word landed heavily between them. Adrian felt a familiar ache in his chest. His wife had died of cancer years ago. Different kind, but the same fear, the same helplessness. The battle she fought alone. The first treatments helped, Elena said quietly. But the doctors say the next stage requires a much stronger therapy. Adrian leaned forward slightly. How much? Elena hesitated. For a moment, it looked like she might refuse to answer. Then she finally spoke. She told him the number. Adrian didn't react. But inside, something in him went completely still. The amount she mentioned was less than the price of the watch on his wrist. It was less than what he once spent on a single business dinner. But for Elena, it was everything. "You've been trying to pay this alone?" Adrian asked. She nodded. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena turned her teacup slowly in her hands. "Because it isn't your burden." "You pay me to work in your house," she said softly. "I do my job. What happens in my life outside your house shouldn't become your responsibility." Adrian stared at her. "You've worked for me 19 years, he said. Elena gave a small, sad smile. "Yes. And in those 19 years, she said gently, you have already carried enough pain of your own." She paused before continuing. "You lost your wife. I didn't want you to look at me with pity." Adrian spoke quietly. "Pity." Elena nodded. "Yes." The walk home. Later that night, Adrian left the cafe alone. His driver had already arrived to pick him up, but Adrian waved him away. "I'll walk." The driver looked surprised. Adrian never walked anywhere. But tonight he needed the cold air. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement. He walked 12 blocks back to his penthouse. When he arrived, he didn't turn on the lights. He simply stood in the dark living room. Through the glass walls, the entire city stretched beneath him. Millions of glowing windows. Millions of lives. For the first time in a very long time, Adrian Whitmore felt completely painful. For 19 years, Elena had taken care of his family. She had held his son when he cried. She had kept his home warm during the darkest years of his life. And while she was doing all of that, her own life had been full of silent struggles he never even noticed. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, then slowly closed it again. He wasn't thinking about business tonight. He was thinking about a 15-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed. A boy who wanted to become an engineer. A boy trying to sound brave for his grandmother. He looked out at the city again and quietly asked himself a question he had never asked before. What kind of man do I want to be?
The next morning, Adrian Whitmore was awake before sunrise. At 5:30 a.m., he was already sitting at his desk, not reading business reports, not checking company emails. Instead, he was staring at his phone. Finally, he picked it up and made a call. "Patricia?" he said when the line connected. Patricia Lawson was Adrian's personal lawyer and one of the few people who had worked with him long enough to understand when something important was happening. "Yes, Adrian," she replied. "I need you to contact St. Matthew Medical Center," he said. "Oncology department. There's a patient there, Mateo Morales, 15 years old." Patricia paused briefly. "I want the full cost of his treatment plan," Adrian continued. "Not the basic treatment they offer when someone can't afford more. I want the best treatment they have available." Another pause. Then Adrian added quietly, "And Patricia, I want this handled anonymously. My name stays out of it. Patricia understood immediately. I'll have the numbers by noon. A morning like any other. At exactly 7 a.m., Elena arrived at the penthouse, just like she had every morning for 19 years. But today she looked different. Her shoulders were slightly tense. Her eyes carried the quiet worry of someone expecting bad news. Adrian noticed immediately. He was standing in the kitchen pouring his own coffee. That alone surprised her. He almost never did that. "Good morning," Adrian said. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Elena replied softly as she placed her bag down. She reached for her apron. "Elena?" Adrian said gently. She stopped. "I want you to know something." She looked up. "Nothing between us has changed." He paused. "Your job is safe." Elena stared at him for a moment. The tension in her shoulders loosened slightly. "Okay," she said quietly. Then she tied her apron and began her morning work like always. But both of them knew something inside the house had shifted. The call that changed everything. At 11:47 a.m., Adrian's phone rang. It was Patricia. He closed his office door. "I spoke with the hospital," she said. "They confirmed the advanced therapy is the best option for his type of leukemia." She explained the cost. The gap between Elena's insurance and the full treatment price was enormous. It was more than a full year of Elena's salary. Adrian didn't hesitate. "Can we pay it today?" "Yes," Patricia said. "Then do it. Pay the entire amount directly to the hospital billing department. Flag it under an anonymous donor fund." "Understood," Patricia said. "And Adrian?" "Yes?" "That boy has a very good chance if he receives this treatment." Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Then make sure he gets it." Something inside him changed. After the call ended, Adrian sat quietly. He had closed billion-dollar deals before. Those moments usually came with excitement, adrenaline, victory. But this felt different. This feeling was calmer, warmer, like something tight inside his chest had finally loosened. 2 days later. 2 days later, Elena was cleaning the kitchen counter when her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. She normally ignored personal calls during work, but when she saw the caller ID, her stomach dropped. St. Matthew Medical Center. She quickly removed one glove and answered. "Mrs. Morales?" the voice asked. "Yes," Elena replied nervously. "I'm calling about your grandson, Mateo." Elena gripped the counter tightly. "Is he okay?" "Yes, he's fine," the woman said quickly. "I'm calling about his medical account." Elena's heart pounded. The woman continued. "There appears to have been a payment made yesterday." Elena frowned. "I'm sorry?" "The entire treatment balance has been paid in full by an anonymous donor." Elena froze. "What?" "The full cost for the advanced therapy has been completely covered by an anonymous donor. You no longer have any financial responsibility for the treatment." For several seconds, Elena couldn't breathe. "Anonymous?" she whispered. "Yes." The call ended. She already knew. Elena stood in the middle of the kitchen. The polishing cloth was still in her hand, the counter half cleaned, but she wasn't thinking about any of it. She didn't have proof. The hospital never mentioned a name, but after 19 years in that household, she knew. She slowly walked down the hallway toward Adrian's office. The door was open. She knocked twice. Adrian looked up from his computer. Elena stood there with one rubber glove still in her hand. Her eyes were filled with emotion she was trying very hard to control. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said softly. "The hospital called me." Adrian said nothing. "They told me Mateo's treatment has been paid for." Silence. "By an anonymous donor." Elena took a slow breath. Then she asked the question, "Was it you?" Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he answered simply, "Yes." The moment she broke. Elena stood there in the doorway. Her lips trembled slightly.
For years, she had been the strong one. She held Lucas when he cried for his mother. She held Matteo through painful nights of chemotherapy. She had carried everything quietly, without asking for help. But now, 2 tears slipped down her face. She quickly covered her mouth with her gloved hand, trying to regain control. Adrian slowly stood up. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. Elena lowered her hand. Her voice was steady again. "Because in this house," she said, "I am the one who helps." She paused. "That is my role." Then she said something Adrian would never forget. "I didn't know how to be the one who needed help." The room fell silent. Finally, Adrian spoke. "You don't have to be only one thing in this house." Elena looked at him, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for saving my grandson." Adrian shook his head gently. "Just make sure he gets better."
3 days after the hospital bill was paid, Elena stood outside St. Matthew Medical Center again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Adrian Whitmore stood beside her. He looked slightly uncomfortable in the quiet hospital environment, his expensive suit feeling strangely out of place among patients and nurses moving through the halls. Elena noticed. "You don't have to come inside," she said gently. Adrian shook his head. "I want to meet him." For a moment, Elena studied his face. Then she smiled softly. "Okay." The first meeting. They walked down the familiar oncology hallway. Machines beeped quietly behind closed doors. Doctors spoke in calm voices. Elena stopped outside a small room. She knocked lightly before opening the door. "Matteo," she said warmly. The boy in the hospital bed looked up. Despite the weakness in his body, his eyes were bright and curious. "Grandma," he said with a tired smile. Then he noticed Adrian standing behind her. "Who's that?" Elena stepped aside slightly. "This is Mr. Adrian Whitmore." Matteo raised his eyebrows. "That sounds like a superhero name." Adrian blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It had been a long time since someone spoke to him that honestly. "Well," Adrian said, stepping closer, "I'm afraid I don't have any superpowers." Matteo tilted his head. "Are you rich?" Elena gasped softly. "Matteo!" But Adrian chuckled again. "Yes," he admitted, "a little." Matteo smiled. "Cool." The chessboard. On the small hospital table beside the bed was a chessboard. The pieces were halfway through a game. Adrian noticed immediately. "You play chess?" he asked. Matteo tilted his head. "I'm pretty good." Adrian pulled up the chair beside the bed. "Mind if I try?" Matteo's eyes lit up. "Oh, you're going down." For the next 40 minutes, something unusual happened. The billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar deals across the world sat beside a hospital bed playing chess with a 15-year-old boy. Matteo talked constantly about school, about robotics, about how he wanted to build machines that could help doctors one day. Adrian listened carefully, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about money or business or power. He was just enjoying the moment. Then, Matteo moved his queen across the board. Checkmate. Adrian stared at the board. Then he laughed again. "You planned that 5 moves ago, didn't you?" Matteo grinned proudly. "Yep." A question that stayed with him. As Adrian stood up to leave, Matteo spoke again. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes?" Matteo hesitated for a moment. Then he asked a question that seemed innocent, but it stayed with Adrian long after he left the hospital. "If you're really rich, why do you still look sad sometimes?" The room went quiet. Elena looked at Adrian. Matteo quickly added, "Sorry, I didn't mean—" Adrian raised a hand gently. "No," he said softly, "that's a fair question." He thought for a moment, then answered honestly. "Because sometimes people spend their whole lives building things,
but forget to build the things that actually matter. Matteo frowned slightly, trying to understand. Then he said something simple. "Well, you helped me, so that counts." Adrian smiled. Yes, it does." Something bigger begins. That night, Adrian returned to his penthouse again, but this time he didn't stand quietly looking at the city. Instead, he opened his laptop and started typing emails, calls, scheduled meetings. The next morning, the entire executive board of Whitmore Industries received an urgent meeting request. The executives expected it to be about investments or acquisitions, but when Adrian walked into the boardroom, he said something none of them expected. "I want to start a foundation." The executives exchanged confused looks. Adrian continued, "Medical assistance programs, employee family support funds, education scholarships, and cancer treatment funding for children who can't afford it." One executive finally asked, "Why now?" Adrian thought of a hospital room, a chessboard, and a brave 15-year-old boy who asked honest questions. Then he answered simply, "Because I finally realized what success is supposed to be for." The beginning of something new. A few weeks later, Matteo began his new treatment. The doctors were optimistic. The therapy was working. Elena continued working at the Whitmore home, but something had changed between Adrian and Elena. Not employer and servant, something closer to family. And every Wednesday evening, Adrian now visited the hospital too, not as a billionaire, but as the man who still owed Matteo a chess rematch.